and welcome to the Harborview. I'm Joe Collymore. Andrea Young is a longtime advocate for historic preservation here in the town of Hingham. Today we will discuss two of the most important powers for historic preservation, that of the Hingham Historical Commission and the Hingham Historic Districts Commission, of which she serves as administrator for both. So Andrea, first off, it's great to have you here with us here on Harborview.
Thank you.
And I am so fascinated by the work of the two organizations, that being the Hingham Historic Districts Commission and the Hingham Historical Commission.
Mm-hmm.
But for the casual viewer, sometimes it can be a little confusing as to which commission does what. So let's talk about each for a minute. So let's start with the Historic Districts Commission and its charge.
The Historic Districts Commission is a design review body, and their charge is to review projects on properties to make sure that whatever changes are being made to the exterior, and they only have jurisdiction over the exterior, not the interior, that those changes are appropriate in terms of mass and scale and fitting in with the streetscape and so forth. So there are a number of criteria that they look at in order to determine whether something is appropriate.
And how long has the Historic Districts Commission been in existence?
Well, the districts began in the late 80s. Those were the initial districts. The first one was the Lincoln Historic District, which was the part of North Street that is closest to the harbor. And North Street is arguably one of the oldest streets in the country, actually. So began there, and then each district moved a little bit further out, so that we're now probably about 8 main districts, but about 15 or so with extensions. A number of them have been extended.
And within those districts, we have historical properties.
Yes.
And it is within the purview of the Historical Commission that oversees the work within some of those properties. Is that correct?
Actually, properties that under the jurisdiction of the Historical Commission are those properties that have significance, either architecturally or historically, but they are not located within an historic district. So that is the mechanism for protecting properties that are outside of historic districts. It's not a very strong mechanism. It's certainly not as strong as for the properties that are in historic districts. That's the strongest form of protection for an historic property.
And within the historic districts, it's my understanding that we have how many assets approximately?
Well, we have about 700 plus properties, and by that I mean either residences or buildings of sorts. We also have some other, we have archaeological areas of significance, like Glad Tidings Rock, for example. And there are a number of things within the inventory that are, and we also include our markers and monuments, some of which are very old, from the 18th century.
A new resident within the town of Hingham, and let's say they're working with a realtor to locate a home. Is it presumable that the realtor would let the prospective homeowner know that you are within a historic district, for example?
It is actually a matter that needs to be disclosed, as you would imagine, because it does have an impact on what the potential buyer can or cannot do with his or her property. So our realtors in Hingham, for the most part, are very good about either, if they don't know whether something is in a district, they'll call and ask. Or we have our inventory online so on the town website, so that people can look and see whether something is in a district or not. But for the most part, our realtors make sure that they know whether a property is regulated or not. And then they will pass that on to the homeowner for the most part. Also, neighbors, if you're in a historic district, you'll hear all sorts of tales from neighbors. And
For example?
oh, well, if you have to go before the hysterical commission, then it's going to be in trouble. But I think for the most part, what we don't always see is that we hear the complaints. They're always loud and clear. But for the most part, we have 70 plus hearings a year, or projects, and most of them are happy. And a lot of people will say that they have a better product after having gone through the process with the district's commission. Because we have architects, we have builders, they're very knowledgeable people on the commission. And and we do have a number of criteria by which we judge whether something is appropriate or not. One thing I'd like to say, I think that a lot of people don't know, is that both the Historical Commission and the Historic Districts Commissions have regulations that come from somewhere else, so that we're not making it up as we go along. And so I have a visual that is a pyramid that shows the Secretary of the Interior at the top, at the apex, and beneath that, the National Park Service, and then below that, the State Historic Preservation Office, and then the local historic districts and historical commissions. So what that means is that on an annual basis, I have to prepare a report for the State Historic Preservation Office, the Mass Historical Commission, and they in turn pass that information along with the information from other historical and historic districts to the National Park Service. And so records are kept, trends are followed, and we get our guidelines from the Secretary of the Interior standards for work on historic properties. So it's not, and the nice thing is, if you look at any state in the Union and look up an historic district, their regulations are going to be very much like ours.
So it's not an arbitrary reaction to, let's say, a property owner who wants to do some type of a renovation on a historical piece of property and find that, there's certain standards that they have to adhere to.
Yes, and we try very hard to make sure that we can be as objective as possible. And to that end, we do have a sheet that we go through with different criteria, which is accessible to any builder, realtor, homeowner as well, because all of our guidelines and information is online.
I would suppose that today, as homeowners are looking to improve energy efficiency, for example, what might be some examples where an owner of a historical piece of property and they need to go greener, if you will, and find better efficiencies for energy? Give me some examples.
Well, the first thing is that there's nothing more green than an original historic building. By the time you start tearing things off and putting things back on, you lose a lot of original fabric, and you're replacing it with manufactured fabric, and a lot of energy is consumed. That's in the extreme, but a lot of times we find that with respect to windows, people are very concerned. If they have the original windows, which we don't have a lot of left in town, but we do have some very old windows. And typically they are single pane, true divided light, meaning there's one pane of glass. mostly covered by a storm. And lately we have such things as energy panels, which can be placed inside the home or outside. But the replacement window industry has done a great job of making people feel as though they have to replace whatever they have. And so I think that is one of the most frustrating things for all of us local historic districts in the Northeast particularly. Not so much, once you get past the Midwest, they're not so much worried about windows in California, but we are here. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And so we do have a lot of literature to guide people as to how to repair their original windows, how to make sure that they can reach their energy requirement with historic wooden windows.
Some of our historical homes using materials that were available, plentiful at the time, including, for example, lead.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a concern today, particularly when you're bringing, young families into some of these historical homes?
Mm-hmm.
And how can perhaps the commission help families navigate that slippery slope involving old, legacy materials such as lead in the homes?
Mm-hmm. Most, I have to say that we've had very few issues, I think, because most people, some of that has been mitigated a long time ago. It's very rare that we find, especially when there's small children, I mean, that's the major concern, that the lead paint hasn't been encapsulated at least or removed very often. And we do have places where we can refer people who would like to get lead paint removed from their windows, and especially on the interior of the windows and the sash, the moving parts, because you just don't want that dust. So there are ways to mitigate that as well.
How long have you been on the Historical Districts Commission and the Historical Commission?
Gosh, too long, Joe. I think actually probably about 20 years now. I have been
you've got some stories
staff.
to share.
Yeah, I do have a few stories to share, I think. Some, most of them, I really have to say that my job is mostly a go-between. My job is to remain neutral, and so I have to be accessible both to the applicant and also to either commission to advise. And so I find that establishing a relationship with people early on, an applicant who wants to do something, I can, sometimes head off what might be an unfortunate situation, or save them some money so that they don't come with plans that I know aren't going to be approved. So, but I think it's mostly, people are, for the most part, very enjoyable, very delightful to work with, and they want to do the right thing. I met a great many professionals that I admire, from building contractors to architects to designers, and so that's really the nice part of my job.
I would think that as an applicant, it would behoove them to find an architect and employ the services of that architect who has prior experience with the commission.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, if it's particularly if it's a large job or a complex job, it is very helpful. And we have worked with so many, and unfortunately we don't make recommendations. We can't do that as a town board, but we find that people gravitate toward people who will do a good job.
Now, the makeup of the commission itself.
Mm-hmm.
These are positions that are appointed by the Board of Selectmen?
That is correct.
And how many members on the commission?
On the Historical Commission, there are 7. And on the Historic Districts Commission, it's a maximum of 10. There are 5 voting members and 5 alternate members. And they have to bring certain expertise with them. We need to have an architect as both an alternate and a voting member. And we need a resident of an historic district. We need to have, and we do have usually a builder, which is very, very helpful. We have a planning board designee and someone who represents the Historical Society. So it gives us, and everybody brings their own expertise.
Any experts on the board who have, let's say, backgrounds in myths and other elements of history? Case in point, if one is looking at buying a historical home, it begs the question, is it haunted? Have you ever encountered any home perhaps that may have come with such a story, some lore?
Oh, yes. There are always a number of stories. One in particular, the most recent, I think, is house on North Street. And the owner came to me and showed me 2 photographs that when they moved into the property were not in the attic. The attic was totally clean, but then these 2 pictures of 2 men appeared. They were just there one day. And so the owner began to do some research on that and couldn't quite find out the connection. But beyond that, at night, they hear little footsteps going up to the 2nd floor, and on a regular basis as a child's footsteps. And also, there are security cameras in this location. And so one morning they were looking at the security cameras, and there was a whirlwind that had taken some papers, and no windows were open. But anyway, so that was recorded. So it's really very interesting. And there are people who firmly believe that they are they're living side by side with someone from the past.
I have to question, is there anyone on the board, on the commission, with the nickname of Ghostbuster, for example?
No.
Okay.
We don't. Nobody. But we do have some great people on our boards, and that's the magic of. And this town, it's great. There are people who want to volunteer their expertise. We have attorneys on the Historical Commission. We have a couple of attorneys. We have someone actually who's from the sewer department who has the Hingham Then and Now Facebook page. And so he's very talented and has great resources, photographic resources. There's also, you've met Elizabeth, who has done wonderful videos, the shipyard for one, and she did the Benjamin Lincoln House, and has recently done something to explain Tuttleville.
Ah, yes.
So we're very excited about seeing that.
I am also very excited about that because, of course, I have dear friends and extended family members who can trace their roots back to Tuttleville. So very excited about that work that'll be forthcoming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I am too, because it's something is little known. Some of the areas that were so important to us over the years, and Finnville is another example, which is further South Hingham.
You know, that's an interesting point that bears mentioning. Hingham is so rich in its historical diversity, and the Historical Commission really should be commended for having that forthright courage to go forward and really bring to the front here some of this history that unfortunately has fallen by the wayside over the years.
Well, thank you. People work very hard and to accomplish that. and everybody has their. We started an essay contest, for example, for high school students, and one of our commission members is Jim Conroy, who has published a number of books, and most recently his book is about Jefferson. So it's, and as I said, we have attorneys, we have other people who are just interested in live in historic properties and are great stewards and are critical in terms of helping to coach other people to be great stewards as well.
In fact, I'm looking forward to meeting with Jim Conroy in the new year. I believe we're going to have him as a guest here. What are you looking forward to with respect to the commissions in 2020? What's got you excited?
Well, let's see. I think for the Historical Commission, there's a lot to look forward to in terms of, as I mentioned to you, we're looking at signage for Tuttleville and for Finnville. And we've published a number of books. There's a possibility that we'll be publishing yet another one on the history of the homes in Hingham. So I'm very excited about that. We also have, with the Historic Districts Commission, there's always a possibility of extending an historic district. It's a long process, but there have been people who are very interested in extending the Liberty Plain Historic District, for example, so up to Queen Anne's Corner. So we'll have to see.
When we look at some of the development that's planned going forward down on the waterfront, and extending all the way out toward World's End, as an example, does some of that encompass part of the historic districts?
No. Actually, the historic district stops at the 3 Otis Street, which is Red Eye Roasters.
Yes.
And so the park with the Iron Horse, which is really not an iron horse, but a bronze horse, is really the end of the jurisdiction there. But we do, the district does continue further up 3A. The Historical Commission is involved to some extent, depending on the wharves in particular. So as we go forward planning to raise the wharves, the commission was involved in the kinds of materials that would be used to do that.
Andrea, let's talk about the work of the Historical Commission and some of the great work that's going on there.
The Historical Commission is really responsible for maintaining our historic resources overall. They have charge of fiduciary responsibility for the Memorial Bell Tower and for the fountain at Queen Anne's Corner and a number of monuments and markers and sculptures, including the seated Lincoln at Fountain Park and also the Pro Patria at Gloria, which most people refer to as the Iron Horse, which is bronze, but as I said before. But anyway, so they're responsible, and to that end, we do have an art conservator who comes periodically to maintain the condition, because over time, all these monuments and the markers with the bronze plates and the granite, they do get dirty and acid rain and all sorts of other stuff. We do have, unfortunately, some graffiti gets scratched into particularly the flank of the Iron Horse. That's very common. The other thing that the commission does besides maintain all of these things is we have published books. We published in the 80s, Not All Is Changed, which is the text that talks about the history of Hingham. The commission also published Mike Schillen's book, When I Think of Hingham, and there were two versions of that, 2 editions rather, and most recently Buckettown, which was a wonderful success, and also most recently Tranquility Grove, thanks to Martha Buick and all her work. This commission also administers the Greenbush Historic Preservation Trust, which was given, well, I don't know if it was given, but we ended up getting $1.35 million from the MBTA, thanks to the work of Alexander Macmillan, who is now our town historian, but was special counsel at that time, and was to the town for the Greenbush resurrection. Anyway, he negotiated the tunnel under Hingham Square, and also arranged for the town to have this $1.35 million trust. And the purpose of the trust is to make sure that over time, that if there are ill effects from the Greenbush right-of-way going through a lot of the historic properties through town, that those can be rectified and maintained. So on an annual basis, the commission gives out $100,000 in grants, and they go to, this is the one grant, or the one source that private homeowners can take advantage of. So as long as a homeowner is along the Greenbush right-of-way in one of the districts, or one of the National Register eligible historic districts that go along the right-of-way, they're eligible to apply to do some work. We've had people restore their windows. We've had people do work on barns to help shore them up, and a number of other projects. So the commission has given funds to Glastonbury Abbey to work on their tower, because they're right along the right-of-way there, to the Country Club, to the Historical Society for the Old Ordinary, and also for Old Derby Academy, and there are just a number of other things. So anyway, it's a great job that the commission does.
Is there anything else, Andrea, that you want to share with us?
Oh gosh, I could talk forever, I think, but it's just, we're very fortunate, I think, to live in a town like Hingham, where we have more homes from the 17th and 18th century than most towns. We also have some original homesteads that have been so well preserved and taken care of, so that the history really is still alive in Hingham. The thing I think that is probably our biggest challenge is when people purchase a property, it is always discouraging if they, begin to demolish the interior and redo everything before they even know what they have. So we do have a homeowner education program, and we have somebody who's available to go out and let people know what that staircase means exactly, or that window, or is that original hardware on that interior door. So because we feel if people understand what they have, then they're less likely to let it go so easily. So,
well, Andrea, I want to thank you very much for visiting with us, and you have to promise me that you'll come on back and
I would love to,
and update me on some of this great work that the commissions are doing.
Okay, thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having us, and happy holidays.
Thank you, you too.